Wind does not go through a wall. It goes around a wall. It goes over a wall. It goes under a wall. And when it cannot find a way around, or over, or under, it goes through every crack, every gap, every loose joint, every place where one piece of building material meets another, and the seal between them is imperfect. A log cabin built in September, when the logs are green and swollen with sap, and the chinking between them is fresh and tight, becomes a different building in January, when the logs have dried and shrunk, and the chinking has cracked and pulled away from the wood, and the gaps between the logs have opened from hairline fractures to quarter-inch channels that the wind exploits with surgical precision. The wind finds every gap. It does not miss any, and through every gap it drives cold air into the cabin interior, replacing the warm air that the stove has worked to produce, creating drafts that no amount of stoking can overcome. The standard response to wind infiltration in the 1890s was to re-chink. Every fall, before the first hard freeze, the farmer walked around his cabin with a bucket of clay and moss and pressed fresh chinking into every gap he could find. The cracks between logs, the joints at the corners, the spaces around the window frames and door frames, the gaps where the stovepipe penetrated the roof. The chinking worked for a while. Fresh clay mixed with moss or straw was pliable and adhesive and filled the gaps completely. But clay shrinks as it dries, and on the northern frontier, the drying was accelerated by the extreme low humidity of winter air. The same 8 to 10% indoor humidity that made skin crack and furniture split. The fresh chinking dried and shrank and cracked within weeks, and by midwinter the gaps had reopened, and the wind was back inside the cabin. Some builders used lime mortar instead of clay. Lime mortar was harder and more durable than clay, but it was also more rigid, and when the log shrank and moved with seasonal moisture changes, the rigid mortar cracked and separated from the wood rather than flexing with it. Some builders packed the gaps with oakum, tarred rope fiber used in ship caulking, which was more flexible than clay or mortar, but expensive and difficult to obtain on the frontier. Some builders hung blankets or hides on the interior walls to block the drafts, accepting that the wind would penetrate the walls, but attempting to stop it before it reached the living space. Every method was a partial solution. None of them sealed the building completely, because the fundamental problem was that a log wall is an assembly of individual pieces with joints between them, and no joint in a log wall is perfectly sealed, and the wind finds every imperfection. Now, I.E. Derivenko had a different approach. He sealed his cabin from the outside with ice. The idea was not original to I.E. It was ancient, as old as the Yakut people of northeastern Siberia, where I.E. had been born and raised in the village of Oymyakon, one of the coldest permanently inhabited places on Earth. Winter temperatures in Oymyakon routinely reach 60 below zero Fahrenheit. The air is so cold that spit freezes before it hits the ground. Exhaled breath crystallizes into a fog of ice particles that hang in the still air like smoke. At these temperatures, everything freezes: water, soil, metal, flesh, and the Yakut people had learned over centuries to use the freezing not as an enemy, but as a building material. The Yakut winter house, the balan, was a log structure with thick walls, a low-pitched sod roof, and a floor of packed earth. The construction was similar in many respects to the cabins of the American frontier, but the Yakut added one technique that frontier builders did not use. In the fall, before the first hard freeze, they plastered the exterior walls of the balan with a thick layer of cattle dung mixed with clay, a practice called kurik. And then, as the temperature dropped below freezing and stayed there. They threw water against the dung and clay layer repeatedly over several days until the entire exterior of the building was coated in a shell of ice several inches thick. The ice shell sealed every crack, every gap, every joint in the building envelope with a continuous airtight frozen membrane that the wind could not penetrate. The wind could blow against the ice shell at any speed and find no entry point. The ice had no joints, no cracks, no gaps. It was a single continuous surface, bonded to the building by the freezing process, that turned a leaky log structure into an airtight enclosure. Yakut arrived in northern Alberta in 1893, part of a small wave of Russian and Siberian immigrants who had crossed the Pacific to British Columbia and then moved inland seeking land and opportunity. He was a farrier and a blacksmith, skills that were in constant demand on the frontier, and he established a homestead and a small smithy near the trading settlement of Peace River, where the winters were severe enough to remind him of home and where his Yakut building knowledge would prove its worth. The cabin he built in the fall of 1893 was standard frontier construction. Spruce logs, saddle-notched corners, moss and clay chinking, a sod roof, a single room approximately 18 by 16 feet with a large cast-iron stove and a stone chimney. The cabin was well built, but it was not airtight. No log cabin was airtight. The first winter, 1893 to 94, confirmed what I already knew. The wind penetrated the chinking. The cabin was drafty. The stove consumed wood at a rate that was higher than necessary because half the heat it produced was being lost through air infiltration, and the temperature was uneven, warm near the stove, cold near the walls, and frigid near the floor where the cold air settled after entering through the gaps. In the fall of 1894, IE prepared the ice shell. The preparation began in October, before the permanent freeze. IE mixed a plaster of cattle dung, clay, and straw, the same Cureek mixture used in Yakut construction, and applied it to the exterior log walls in a layer approximately 2 inches thick. The mixture served two purposes. First, it filled the large gaps, the cracks in the chinking, the openings around the window and door frames, the spaces at the corner joints, with a sticky, flexible material that conformed to the irregular surfaces of the log wall better than clay or mortar alone. The cattle dung provided binding strength and flexibility. The clay provided bulk and adhesion. The straw provided tensile reinforcement that prevented the mixture from cracking as it dried. Second, the rough textured surface of the dried dung clay plaster provided an ideal bonding surface for ice, far better than smooth log surfaces, which tended to shed water before it could freeze in place. When the temperature dropped below 20 degrees and stayed there, which occurred in early November in the Peace River country, I began the icing process. Each evening, after dark, he filled 2 large wooden buckets at the well and carried them to the cabin, starting at the base of the north wall, the windward wall, which received the most punishment from the prevailing winter wind. He threw the water against the wall in broad, sweeping arcs, coating the dung clay plaster with a thin film of water that froze within minutes in the sub-zero air. Each application added approximately 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch of ice to the wall surface. He repeated the process on all 4 walls and the lower portion of the roof, the eaves, and the first 2 feet of the roof slope, where wind-driven snow tended to penetrate the sod covering. The icing process took approximately 30 minutes per evening and consumed approximately 15 gallons of water. 7 or 8 trips to the well with 2 buckets, each thrown against the walls in a systematic pattern that ensured complete coverage. Ayuyai performed the icing every evening for approximately 2 weeks, 14 applications, building up an ice shell that was approximately 1 to 2 inches thick on the windward walls and approximately 3/4 of an inch thick on the leeward walls and roof eaves. The total water consumption was approximately 200 gallons over the 2-week icing period, a significant amount of well water, but not an unreasonable quantity for a man who was hauling water daily regardless. The result was a cabin wrapped in a continuous shell of ice from the foundation to the roofline. The ice was translucent, milky white where it had frozen in multiple thin layers, clear where it had pooled and frozen in thicker sections. And it followed every contour of the underlying wall surface, filling every crack and gap and irregularity with frozen water that sealed the building envelope completely. The wind, which had previously penetrated the cabin through dozens of gaps and cracks in the chinking, now struck a smooth, continuous ice surface that offered no entry point. The ice shell did not flex. It did not crack from wind pressure. It did not dry and shrink like clay chinking. It was, as long as the temperature remained below freezing, which in the Peace River country meant from November through March, approximately 5 months, a perfect airtight seal. If you want to know what happened when a Yakut blacksmith coated his cabin in ice, while every neighbor said he was building a death trap that would melt and flood his house, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. The thermal effect was immediate and dramatic. On the first night after the icing was complete, a night when the temperature dropped to 22 below zero with a wind of 25 miles per hour, the cabin interior held at 64 degrees with the stove burning at a moderate rate. The previous winter, under identical conditions, the interior had held at approximately 50 degrees at the same burn rate, requiring Ayuyai to stoke the stove to maximum output to reach 60 degrees. The ice shell had reduced the air infiltration to near zero, and the 14-degree improvement in interior temperature was entirely attributable to the elimination of draft heat loss. The fuel savings were equally dramatic. Ayuyai burned approximately 3.5 cords of spruce during the winter of 1893 to 94, his first winter, without the ice shell. During the winter of 1894 to 95, with the ice shell, he burned approximately 2 cords, a reduction of approximately 43%. The reduction was consistent with the physics of air infiltration. In a typical frontier cabin, approximately 40 to 50% of total heat loss was attributable to air infiltration through gaps and cracks in the building envelope, and eliminating that infiltration cut the total heat loss nearly in half. The wind noise changed as dramatically as the temperature. Before the ice shell, the wind was audible inside the cabin, a constant whistle and moan as the moving air found the gaps and forced its way through them, producing a sound that was sometimes faint and sometimes alarming depending on the wind speed. After the ice shell, the wind was reduced to a distant hiss, the sound of air moving across the smooth exterior ice surface without penetrating it. The cabin was quiet. The stillness was disconcerting at first. Ayuyai's wife Kees said the silence made her ears ring. But within a week, it became normal. And when Kees visited a neighbor's cabin and heard the familiar whistle of wind through the chinking, the sound seemed unbearable, a constant irritation that she had previously accepted as the background noise of winter. Hollis Crew, whose homestead was a quarter-mile south, came to examine the ice shell in December. He walked around the cabin, pressing his hand against the ice surface, noting how it filled every gap and followed every contour of the underlying wall. He rapped his knuckles against it and heard the solid, dense sound of frozen water bonded to wood and clay. He looked at the stovepipe and the chimney, which were the only parts of the building not coated in ice. I had left them clear because the heat from the stove and chimney would have melted ice on contact, creating a perpetual wet zone that would have damaged the mortar. Hollis asked the obvious question: what happens in the spring? The spring was the objection that everyone raised, and it was a legitimate concern. The ice shell was a winter-only system. When the temperature rose above freezing in late March or early April, the ice would melt, and 200 gallons of meltwater would run down the exterior walls of the cabin and pool around the foundation. If the drainage was poor, the meltwater could saturate the foundation logs, promoting rot and insect damage. If the melt was rapid, a sudden warm spell rather than a gradual thaw, the volume of water could be significant enough to flood the crawl space or seep through the foundation into the interior. AI had anticipated this. He had graded the ground around the cabin to slope away from the foundation at approximately 2 inches per foot for a distance of 6 feet, a simple drainage apron that directed meltwater away from the building. He had also laid a course of flat stones around the base of the foundation, creating a splash zone that prevented the meltwater from eroding the soil at the foundation line. The stones also served as a thermal break. They absorbed solar heat during the spring thaw and accelerated the melting of any residual ice at the foundation level, preventing ice dams that could trap water against the lower logs. The spring melt of 1895, II's first spring with the ice shell, was unremarkable. The ice melted gradually over approximately 2 weeks as the daytime temperatures rose above freezing. The meltwater ran down the walls in sheets and rivulets, following the drainage slope away from the foundation. No water entered the cabin. No water pooled at the foundation. The logs beneath the melted ice were dry. The ice had actually protected them from the winter moisture cycle of snow contact and freeze-thaw that damaged exposed log surfaces, and the logs emerged from the melt in better condition than they had been in the previous spring. The dung clay plaster beneath the ice was partially intact. Approximately 70% of the original application was still bonded to the logs, providing a base coat for the following fall's icing. AI patched the missing sections with fresh curate mixture in October and performed the icing cycle again in November, building a new ice shell in the same 2-week process. The second-year icing was faster because the base coat was already in place and required only patching rather than full application. If this story has touched you, share it and subscribe, because the quiet engineering that kept families alive and farms running for generations deserves to be remembered. Hollis' crew built his own ice shell that second winter. His wife Minnie had been suffering from chronic cold exposure all winter. Their cabin was older and draftier than IE's, with chinking that had failed in dozens of places, and the prospect of a warm, airtight cabin with 40% less fuel consumption was compelling. Hollis followed II's method exactly: dung clay base coat in October, ice applications every evening for 2 weeks in November. The result was identical: a dramatic reduction in drafts, a significant improvement in interior temperature, and a fuel savings of approximately 1.5 cords over the winter. Minnie, who had spent 2 winters huddled near the stove with a blanket around her shoulders, was able to sit at the kitchen table comfortably for the first time since they had arrived on the frontier. The settlement blacksmith, a German immigrant named Ulrich Kepler, was skeptical of the ice shell on structural grounds. He argued that the repeated freeze-thaw cycles of the icing process, water applied to cold walls, freezing, then warmed slightly by the interior heat conducted through the logs, then refrozen by the exterior cold, would stress the log surfaces and accelerate deterioration. He had seen ice damage on stone buildings in Germany, where water freezing in cracks expanded and split the stone, and he expected the same process to damage the logs. IY explained the difference. Ice damage to stone and masonry occurs when water enters a crack and freezes, expanding and widening the crack, a process called frost wedging. The ice shell was not water in cracks. It was a continuous layer of ice on the exterior surface of the wall, bonded to the dung clay plaster rather than to the bare wood. The ice did not penetrate the logs. The plaster-based coat sealed the wood surface and prevented water from entering the grain. The ice shell was on the building, not in the building, and the expansion forces of freezing were directed outward, away from the wall surface, rather than inward into the wood. After 5 years of annual ice shell application, II's logs showed no ice damage, no checking, no splitting, no surface deterioration beyond the normal weathering that all exposed logs experienced. The dung clay plaster, in fact, appeared to be protecting the logs from weathering by shielding them from direct sun, rain, and wind abrasion during the non-winter months. By 1900, 6 winters of ice shell application, the system had proven itself comprehensively. II's fuel consumption had averaged approximately 2 cords per winter, compared to 3.5 cords for comparable unshelled cabins in the settlement. The savings of 1.5 cords per winter, at the local price of $8 per cord, amounted to $12 per year, a significant sum when the average homesteader's annual cash income was approximately $250. Over 6 winters, the cumulative fuel savings were approximately $72, against a construction cost of essentially zero. The dung clay plaster was made from materials available on the farm: cattle dung from the barn, clay from the creek bank, straw from the threshing floor, and the water for the icing was drawn from the well at no cash cost. The only expense was II's time, approximately 30 minutes per evening for 14 evenings, plus a day in October for the base coat application, a total of approximately 2 days of labor per year for a $12 annual return. 4 families in the settlement adopted the ice shell technique by 1900. The total number never grew beyond 6 for 2 reasons. First, the technique required cattle. The dung clay plaster depended on cattle dung as a binding agent, and families that did not keep cattle had no ready source of the material. II experimented with horse dung as a substitute and found it less effective. Horse dung had less binding strength than cattle dung because horses digest their feed more completely, leaving less fibrous material in the waste. Second, the technique required commitment. The nightly icing process, while not physically demanding, had to be performed consistently for 2 weeks and could not be interrupted by travel or illness without leaving incomplete coverage that the wind would exploit. Farmers who were frequently away from the homestead during the fall for hunting, trading, or wage work could not maintain the icing schedule. The Sardana improvement of 1898 deserves mention. Sardana was IE's eldest daughter, 15 years old, who had helped with the icing since she was 11. She noticed that the south-facing wall of the cabin, the wall that received the most winter sunlight, lost its ice shell approximately 3 weeks before the other walls because the low winter sun warmed the south wall above freezing during the brief midday sun period, even when the air temperature remained well below zero. The premature melting of the south wall exposed the chinking gaps on that wall to wind penetration weeks before the spring thaw. negating some of the ice shell's benefit during the last month of winter. Sardana's solution was to apply the ice shell thicker on the south wall, approximately 3 inches instead of 1 to 2 inches, so that the greater ice mass took longer to melt during the brief midday sun exposure. The thicker application required approximately 3 additional evenings of icing on the south wall alone, but it extended the south wall's ice coverage by approximately 2 weeks, nearly to the spring thaw date, and maintained the cabin's airtight seal through the entire winter season. It was a small refinement, but it demonstrated the kind of observational intelligence that separated effective frontier engineering from mere imitation. The ice shell technique had one additional benefit that AY discovered in the third winter: pest control. The log cabins of the northern frontier were plagued by insects, particularly wood-boring beetles and carpenter ants, that entered the building through the same gaps and cracks that admitted the wind. The insects laid eggs in the chinking material and in the cracks between logs, and the larvae fed on the wood throughout the winter, emerging in the spring as adult insects that continued the cycle of infestation. The ice shell eliminated this pathway. The continuous ice coating over the exterior walls sealed every potential entry point for insects, and the sub-freezing temperature of the ice killed any eggs or larvae that were present in the chinking when the shell was applied. After 3 years of ice shell application, IE's cabin had noticeably less insect activity than neighboring cabins. Fewer beetles, fewer ants, fewer of the small moths that emerged from wood-boring larvae in the spring. The system operated annually from 1894 through 1908, 14 consecutive winters, until II added a frame-built vestibule and a layer of tar paper to the cabin exterior that provided a permanent windbreak and made the ice shell unnecessary. The ice shell had served for 14 years at zero material cost, requiring nothing but labor, water, and cattle dung, materials that were freely available on every homestead that kept cattle. 14 winters, 200 gallons of water per year, 30 minutes per evening for 2 weeks, a 43% reduction in fuel consumption, a 14-degree improvement in interior temperature, 0 drafts, 0 wind noise, and a Yakut blacksmith who understood that water, which was his enemy above freezing, became his strongest building material below it. Bolot, IE's son, continued the ice shell tradition after IE's death in 1912, maintaining it on the original cabin until the family built a new frame house in 1918. 24 consecutive winters of ice shell application on a single building. The logs beneath the shell, when the cabin was finally dismantled, were in remarkably good condition. The dung clay plaster and the annual ice coating had protected the wood from weathering, insect damage, and the moisture cycling that destroyed unprotected log surfaces within 15 to 20 years. The physics of ice as a sealant deserve deeper examination because they explain why ice works better than any material available on the frontier for sealing a log building. Every sealant faces the same challenge. It must fill an irregular gap between two surfaces that move relative to each other as temperature and moisture change. Clay chinking fills the gap when it is first applied, but it shrinks as it dries and becomes rigid, and when the logs move, shrinking in winter as they lose moisture, swelling in summer as they absorb it. The rigid clay cannot follow the movement, and it cracks and separates. Lime mortar has the same problem. Oakum is flexible, but it compresses over time and loses its sealing pressure. Every material that is installed in a warm, flexible state and then expected to maintain a seal through the temperature and moisture extremes of a northern winter faces the shrinkage rigidity problem. Ice faces none of these problems because ice is not installed, it is formed. When water is thrown against a wall surface at sub-zero temperatures, it flows into every crack, every gap, every irregularity in the surface before it freezes. It conforms to the exact shape of the gap at the moment of freezing, filling the space completely with no voids, no air pockets, no unsealed margins. And once frozen, the ice does not shrink. Water expands approximately 9% when it freezes, meaning the ice plug in every gap is under slight compression, pressing outward against both surfaces and maintaining positive pressure that keeps the seal tight, even if the surfaces shift slightly. No installed sealant can match this combination of perfect conformity and positive compression. The ice seal is formed by the climate itself, using the very cold that it is intended to defend against. The air tightness of the ice shell could be demonstrated with a simple test that IY performed for visitors. He lit a candle and held it near the interior wall surface of the cabin, moving it slowly along the chinking lines and around the window and door frames. In an unshelled cabin, the candle flame flickered and danced at every gap where wind penetrated the wall. Dozens of points where the flame was deflected by incoming air. In the ice-shelled cabin, the candle flame burned straight and still at every point on every wall. The wind was not entering the building, not through the chinking, not through the corner joints, not through the window frames, not through the door frame. The only air exchange in the building was through the deliberate ventilation that IY maintained, a small, adjustable vent in the gable end of the roof that allowed stale air to escape and fresh air to enter at a controlled rate. The ventilation was essential. An airtight building with a combustion stove will deplete its oxygen supply within hours if no fresh air is admitted, and the carbon monoxide produced by incomplete combustion will accumulate to lethal levels. IY, like every Yakut builder, understood that the ice shell required companion ventilation. You could not seal the building completely and expect the occupants to survive. His ventilation system was a 6-inch diameter hole through the gable wall at the peak of the roof, fitted with a wooden sliding cover that could be opened to any size from fully closed to fully open. The hole was positioned at the highest point of the interior, where the warmest and stalest air accumulated, and the natural convection of warm air rising carried the stale air out through the vent, while fresh cold air entered at the bottom of the building through the door threshold gap. A 1-inch space between the bottom of the door and the threshold stone that II deliberately left unsealed. The ventilation system created a slow, continuous air exchange. Fresh cold air entering low, warming as it rose through the room, and exiting through the high vent, at a rate of approximately 3 to 5 cubic feet per minute, enough to maintain safe oxygen and carbon monoxide levels for 4 occupants and 1 stove. The key was that this was controlled air exchange rather than uncontrolled infiltration. The air entering through the threshold gap was a single known stream that could be regulated by adjusting the door gap with a rolled towel, and the air exiting through the gable vent was similarly controllable. The total heat loss through the controlled ventilation was approximately 10 to 15% of the total building heat loss, compared to the 40 to 50% heat loss through uncontrolled infiltration in an unshelled cabin. The ice shell, combined with controlled ventilation, cut the building's heat loss in half without creating a suffocation hazard. Kees Derivenko managed the interior moisture that the ice shell created. An airtight building retains moisture from cooking, breathing, and the evaporation of water from wet clothing and boots. In an unshelled cabin, this moisture escaped through the same gaps that admitted the wind and the interior humidity remained low, often dangerously low as 8 to 10% in the driest conditions. In the ice-shelled cabin, the moisture was retained, and the interior humidity stabilized at approximately 30 to 35%. A vast improvement over the bone-dry air of an unshelled cabin, but a level that required management to prevent condensation on cold surfaces. The coldest interior surfaces were the windows. Even with the ice shell sealing the walls, the window glass, single pane in the original cabin, was a thermal weak point where the interior warm, moist air contacted a surface cold enough to condense the moisture out of the air. The condensation frosted the glass, reducing light transmission, and the meltwater from the frost dripped onto the windowsill and could promote rot if not managed. Keese addressed this with a simple technique borrowed from her mother-in-law's practice in Oymyakon. She placed a shallow tray of salt on each windowsill. The salt absorbed the condensation moisture from the air immediately adjacent to the cold window surface, reducing the frost formation on the glass and preventing the drip. The salt trays were emptied and refilled every 2 to 3 days. The salt dissolved in the absorbed water and was discarded outside, and fresh, dry salt replaced it. The cost was approximately 20 cents per winter for the salt, a trivial expense for clear windows and dry sills. The second winter improvement was the addition of exterior shutters on the windows. The windows were the only part of the building envelope that the ice shell could not cover. Ice on glass would have blocked all light, and the purpose of the windows was to admit the scarce winter daylight. II built heavy wooden shutters, solid planks hinged to the window frames, that could be closed over the windows at night and during storms, adding a layer of dead airspace between the shutter and the glass that significantly reduced heat loss through the windows during the 16 to 18 hours per day when daylight was absent. The shutters were coated with ice along with the rest of the wall surface, and when closed, they became part of the continuous ice shell. When opened during the brief daylight hours, they exposed the glass to light, while the ice shell on the surrounding wall maintained the overall seal. The condensation management extended to the walls themselves. In the first winter with the ice shell, II noticed a thin film of frost forming on the interior surface of the north wall, the coldest wall, farthest from the stove. The frost formed because the wall surface temperature on the interior side of the north wall was approximately 28 degrees, below the dew point of the interior air at 35% humidity. The frost was not dangerous, but it was unsightly, and it indicated that heat was being lost through that wall section faster than the stove could replace it. IE's solution was to hang a wool blanket on the interior surface of the north wall, spaced approximately 2 inches from the wall surface by wooden pegs. The blanket did not insulate the wall. Wool at 2 inches thick provides perhaps R2 of insulation, but it created a dead airspace between the blanket and the wall that broke the convective loop of warm room air contacting the cold wall surface and being cooled. The frost still formed on the wall behind the blanket, but it was invisible and it did not affect the room temperature or the comfort of the occupants. The cumulative effect of the ice shell system, the Cureek base coat, the 2-week icing process, the controlled ventilation, the moisture management, and the window shutters, was a cabin that performed at a level far beyond any comparable structure in the settlement. The interior temperature was higher, the fuel consumption was lower, the drafts were eliminated, the noise was reduced, the humidity was healthier, and the occupants were more comfortable than in any log cabin without the ice treatment. The total annual cost was approximately 2 days of labor and $0 in materials. The total annual benefit was approximately $12 in fuel savings, plus incalculable improvements in comfort, health, and quality of life. The Crew family's experience with the ice shell was instructive. Hollis and Minnie Crew had the oldest and draftiest cabin in the settlement, a structure that Hollis had built hastily in 1891 before he fully understood the severity of the northern Alberta winters. The cabin leaked air from every joint. The chinking had failed repeatedly. The corner notches were loose. The window frames had pulled away from the logs. Hollis had spent 3 winters re-chinking and resealing and plugging and patching, and every spring he assessed the damage from the previous winter. New cracks, new gaps, new points of failure, and every fall he started the patching process again. It was an endless cycle of deterioration and repair that consumed weeks of labor every year and never achieved a satisfactory result. The ice shell broke this cycle. Hollis applied the Cureek base coat to his cabin in October of 1896 and performed the nightly icing in November, and the result was transformative. The cabin that had been the coldest and draftiest in the settlement became, overnight, one of the warmest and most comfortable. The drafts that had plagued Minnie for 5 years vanished. The fuel consumption dropped by nearly half. The interior temperature, which had never exceeded 55 degrees in previous winters, despite continuous maximum rate burning, reached 62 degrees at moderate burn rate. Minnie told Keese that she had forgotten what it felt like to be warm in the winter and that she had cried the first night the cabin was quiet and still and warm. The improvement in Minnie's health was visible within weeks. She had suffered from chronic respiratory problems every winter, a persistent cough, frequent colds, sore throats that lasted weeks, exacerbated by the cold drafts and the dry air of the leaky cabin. In the ice-shelled cabin, with its eliminated drafts and its improved humidity, her respiratory symptoms diminished rapidly. The cough resolved within 2 weeks. The sore throat cleared. She had 1 cold that winter, compared to 4 or 5 in previous years. The connection between building tightness, indoor air quality, and respiratory health was not understood in medical terms in the 1890s, but the practical result was obvious. A warm, tight cabin with controlled ventilation and reasonable humidity produced healthier occupants than a cold, drafty cabin with uncontrolled air infiltration and bone-dry air. The longevity of the Cureek base coat surprised even Ayei. He had expected to reapply the full base coat every 2 to 3 years, based on his experience in Siberia, where the extreme cold and the intense spring thaw cycle degraded the dung-clay mixture faster. In the Peace River country, where the winters were severe but not Siberian in extremity, the base coat lasted 5 to 6 years before requiring full reapplication. The annual patching, filling in the sections that had been damaged by the spring melt or by physical contact, took approximately half a day compared to the full day required for the initial application. The base coat actually improved with age. The dung-clay mixture hardened over multiple freeze-thaw cycles, becoming denser and more resistant to erosion, and the older sections provided a superior bonding surface for ice compared to fresh application. The settlement's 6 ice-shelled cabins operated through the winter of 1908, 14 years for Ayei's original and progressively fewer for the later adopters. The combined fuel savings across all 6 cabins over the period of operation was estimated at approximately 60 cords of spruce, equivalent to more than $700 in purchased firewood at local prices. The combined labor investment was approximately 12 days per cabin per year, 72 days total across 6 cabins per year. for a labor-to-savings ratio that was among the most favorable of any building improvement available on the frontier. No other technique, not double walls, not additional chinking, not interior wall coverings, not storm windows, achieved the same combination of low cost, high effectiveness, and annual renewability as the ice shell. The blizzard of January 1901 provided the definitive demonstration. The storm struck the Peace River settlement on the 7th of January, with temperatures dropping to 36 below zero and winds of 45 miles per hour, sustained for 3 days with gusts reaching 60. The wind chill exceeded 70 below. Snow fell horizontally, accumulating in drifts that buried fence lines and blocked every door in the settlement. In the cabins without ice shells, the storm was catastrophic in terms of comfort and fuel. The wind drove through every gap in every wall at speeds that no chinking could resist. Ulrich Kepler, the skeptical blacksmith, burned through his entire emergency wood supply in the first 2 days, approximately 1.5 cords of split spruce, consumed at nearly double his normal burn rate, and spent the 3rd day breaking apart a wooden bench and a shelf unit for fuel, because his woodpile outside was buried under a 6-foot drift and unreachable. His cabin interior never exceeded 40 degrees during the storm, despite continuous maximum rate burning, and the wall nearest the wind was coated with a film of frost on the interior surface, where wind-driven snow had penetrated the chinking and melted against the warm interior air before refreezing on the cold wall. Kepler's wife was wrapped in every blanket they owned, sitting within 3 feet of the stove, and still shivering. Their water bucket, placed on the floor in the corner farthest from the stove, froze solid overnight. The eggs in the pantry shelf froze and cracked. A jar of preserved beets on the bottom shelf burst from ice expansion. The cabin was not a shelter during the storm. It was a marginally warmer version of the outdoors, a space where survival was possible, but comfort was not. In Ai's ice-shelled cabin, the storm registered as sound and nothing more. The wind howled across the ice surface, producing a high, thin whistle that was audible but not distressing. The sound of air moving fast over a smooth surface, like wind over a frozen lake. The interior temperature held at 58 degrees at moderate burn rate. IY did not increase his fuel consumption during the storm. He burned the same 20 to 25 pounds of wood per day that he burned on any winter day, because the ice shell was performing identically regardless of the wind speed. The seal was absolute at 5 miles per hour, and it was absolute at 60 miles per hour. The wind could not find a way through 2 inches of solid ice, bonded to a 2-inch dung clay plaster coat over 8-inch spruce logs. There was no gap to exploit. There was no crack to widen. There was no joint to separate. The ice shell also resisted the snow penetration that plagued the unshelled cabins. Wind-driven snow at sub-zero temperatures is dry and fine. The crystals are tiny, approximately 1 to 2 millimeters in diameter, and they behave more like sand than like the wet clumping snow of milder climates. This dry, fine snow is driven by the wind into any opening larger than the crystal size, and it accumulates inside walls, above ceilings, and around window frames, melting when it contacts warm surfaces, and refreezing when it contacts cold ones, creating ice formations inside the building envelope that widen the gaps and admit more snow in a progressive failure cycle. The ice shell stopped this cycle at the exterior surface. The snow crystals struck the smooth ice and bounced off or accumulated in a drift against the base of the wall. but they could not penetrate the continuous ice membrane regardless of the wind speed driving them. After the January storm, Ulrich Kepler came to I's cabin. He had spent 3 days cold, frightened, and burning his furniture for fuel, and he was no longer skeptical. He examined the ice shell, still intact after 3 days of 60-mile-per-hour gusts, not cracked, not peeled, not damaged in any way. He examined the interior, warm, quiet, dry, with no frost on the walls, no snow penetration, no sign that the worst storm in the settlement's history had occurred. He asked Ai to help him apply the ice shell to his own cabin. Ai agreed. They applied the Cureek base coat together in October of 1901 and performed the icing in November. Kepler's fuel consumption that winter dropped by 51%, the largest reduction in the settlement, because Kepler's cabin had been the leakiest and therefore had the most to gain from the ice seal. Kepler, to his credit, acknowledged his error publicly. At a settlement gathering in the spring of 1902, he told the assembled families that he had been wrong about the ice shell, that it was not damaging the logs, that it was not a structural hazard, and that it was the most effective building improvement he had ever seen. Coming from the settlement's blacksmith, a man whose profession required precise understanding of materials and forces, the endorsement carried weight. 2 additional families adopted the technique that fall. The seasonal rhythm of the ice shell became a community event. The Cureek mixing day in October, when the cattle dung, clay, and straw were combined in a large pit and mixed with water to the consistency of thick plaster, was a communal work session where the 6 families who used the technique gathered at one farm, mixed enough plaster for all 6 cabins, and applied it to each cabin in sequence over 2 days. The icing period in November was individual. Each family iced their own cabin on their own schedule, but the nightly routine became a social signal. The sight of a man throwing buckets of water against his cabin walls in the sub-zero darkness became the marker of a certain kind of household, one that was prepared, one that understood the winter, one that would be warm and quiet when the storms came. Ai taught the technique to approximately 20 families over his lifetime, including settlers as far as 50 miles from the Peace River settlement, who had heard about the ice shell through the Trading Post network. Not all of them adopted it permanently. Some found the nightly icing process too labor-intensive. Some did not keep cattle and could not source the dung for the base coat, and some were simply unwilling to coat their cabins in what they perceived as a layer of frozen manure, despite the fact that the dung clay plaster was odorless once dried and invisible once coated with ice. Cultural resistance was as significant a barrier as practical limitations. The ice shell looked strange. It required an unfamiliar material, cattle dung as a building component, and it came from a tradition, Yakut Siberian, that was unknown and therefore suspect to the European-descended settlers who made up the majority of the frontier population. But for the families who adopted it, the ice shell was transformative. It turned the worst cabins in the settlement into the best. It cut fuel consumption nearly in half. It eliminated drafts completely. It improved interior temperature by 10 to 15 degrees. It reduced wind noise to a whisper. It improved indoor humidity and respiratory health. It cost nothing in materials and required approximately 2 days of labor per year, and it was rebuilt every winter by the very force it was designed to defeat, the cold that froze the water into a seal that no wind could break. The arithmetic was unanswerable. 2 days of labor per year, $0 in materials, a 43% reduction in fuel consumption, a 14-degree increase in interior temperature, 0 drafts in any wind condition, 0 snow penetration, improved humidity, reduced respiratory illness, protected logs, reduced insect damage, a system that was renewed automatically every fall, that performed perfectly every winter, that melted harmlessly every spring, and that left the building beneath it in better condition than it would have been without it. No other building improvement on the northern frontier could match this combination of 0 cost, maximum effectiveness, and perfect renewability. The ice shell was not a compromise. It was not a stopgap. It was the optimal winter building solution for any log structure in any climate where the temperature remained below freezing for 4 or more months per year. No myths, no miracles, just water, cold, cattle dung, and the understanding that the best seal is the one the winter builds for you. The science of the base coat, the cureek, deserves closer examination because it was not simply a rough plaster. It was a composite material with specific properties that made the ice shell possible. Cattle dung is approximately 70% water, 20% cellulose fiber, partially digested plant material, and 10% a mixture of proteins, fats, and minerals. When mixed with clay and straw and allowed to dry, the cellulose fibers act as reinforcement, like rebar in concrete, preventing the clay from cracking as it dries. The proteins and fats in the dung act as a binder, improving the adhesion of the mixture to the log surface. The resulting plaster is flexible enough to accommodate slight log movement without cracking, strong enough to resist wind erosion, and rough-textured enough to provide an excellent mechanical bond for ice. The clay component provided the bulk and the adhesion. Not all clays were equally suitable. The best clay for cureek was a fat clay, high in fine particles, sticky when wet, plastic when moist, that bonded strongly to both the dung fibers and the log surface. Sandy clays and silty clays were less effective because they lacked the sticky plasticity needed for a durable bond. IY tested the local clay by rolling a wet ball of it between his palms and pressing it against a dry log surface. If it stuck firmly and held its shape without cracking as it dried, it was suitable. If it crumbled or fell away, he added more dung to increase the binding strength, or sought clay from a different deposit along the creek bank. The straw component, typically wheat or oat straw, cut to approximately 4-inch lengths, served the same function in the plaster that it serves in adobe brick: tensile reinforcement. Clay and dung alone are strong in compression but weak in tension, meaning they resist being squeezed but not being pulled apart. The straw fibers bridged any cracks that formed during drying, holding the plaster together across the crack and preventing it from falling off the wall in chunks. The optimal ratio was approximately 1 part straw to 4 parts dung-clay mixture by volume, enough fiber to provide reinforcement without so much straw that the mixture became loose and difficult to apply. The application technique was specific. IY applied the cureek from the bottom of the wall upward, pressing the mixture firmly into the gaps between logs, and then smoothing a layer approximately 2 inches thick over the entire wall surface with a flat board used as a trowel. The upward application allowed each section to support the weight of the section above it as the plaster was built up, preventing the wet mixture from sliding down the wall under its own weight. The total application on a typical cabin, 4 walls measuring approximately 18 by 8 feet each, required approximately 300 pounds of cureek mixture and approximately 8 hours of labor for 2 people. The drying time was critical. The base coat needed to dry before the freezing temperature arrived and the icing process began. In the Peace River country, the base coat was typically applied in the first 2 weeks of October, when daytime temperatures were still above freezing, but the nights were cold enough to begin firming the surface. A minimum of 3 weeks of drying time was needed before icing. Less time left the inner layers still moist, and the water in the icing process could not bond properly to a wet surface. IY timed his application to allow exactly 3 to 4 weeks of drying before the permanent freeze, and he monitored the drying progress by pressing his thumb into the surface at various points. When the thumb left no impression, the plaster was dry enough for icing. The thickness of the ice shell varied by wall orientation and by design choice. The standard application, 14 nights of icing with 2 buckets per wall section, produced a shell approximately 1 to 2 inches thick, which was sufficient for wind protection in normal winter conditions. For the January storms, when wind speeds could exceed 60 miles per hour, a thicker shell was more effective. Not because the thinner shell would break. Ice is extremely strong in compression, and the wind pressure, at approximately 8 pounds per square foot, was trivial compared to the compressive strength of ice at approximately 2,000 pounds per square inch. But because a thicker shell had more thermal mass and took longer to sublimate. Sublimation, the direct conversion of ice to water vapor without passing through the liquid phase, was the primary mechanism of ice loss during the winter. At sub-zero temperatures, ice does not melt, but it does slowly sublimate as the dry winter air strips molecules from the ice surface. The rate of sublimation increases with wind speed and decreases with ice thickness, because the sublimation process must remove molecules from the surface layer, and a thicker shell simply has more material to remove before the seal is compromised. A 1-inch shell lost approximately a 1/4 inch to sublimation over a 5-month winter. A 2-inch shell lost the same 1/4 inch but retained 3/4 of its original thickness. The thicker shell on the south wall, Sardana's improvement, compensated for both sublimation and solar warming, maintaining the seal through the entire winter. The tradition that Ayai brought from Oymya Khan to the Peace River was one instance of a broader pattern. Indigenous cold climate peoples around the world had discovered independently that ice could be used as a building material and a sealant. The Inuit used snow and ice to build the igloo, a structure that was entirely composed of frozen water in its solid form. The Sami of northern Scandinavia packed snow against the walls of their goati for additional insulation. The Yakut used the ice shell technique on their balaan. Each culture had arrived at the same fundamental insight. In a climate where the temperature remains below freezing for months at a time, frozen water is not a temporary phenomenon to be endured, but a permanent material to be employed.